People are a lot more comfortable now just producing for smaller and more niche crowds. There's a feeling of like, I actually don't want my stuff to go viral. I don't want it to escape context, which is, I think, a fairly new behavior. It feels much more like still waters that are kind of running deep where you can't always even see what are the coolest things that are happening.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. I like nothing more than finding a name for a phenomenon that's all around me, but that I don't have a name for yet. Well, the writer and theorist Nadia Asparouhova has a new book out that offered me exactly this. It's called Anti-Mimetics: Why Some Ideas Resist Spreading. We tend to think of cultural influence as being tied to popularity and visibility. What Asparouhova wants us to pay attention to is a whole other class of cultural stuff whose influence is linked instead to being hard to find or difficult to understand. These are what she calls anti-memes. It's the opinion that puts you at odds with some people but really connects you to others, so you're careful how you share it. It's the artwork that looks like nonsense to the majority of the audience, but is full of intricate meaning to fans. The theory of anti-memes is about how some of our most intense cultural investments are below the radar, not because they haven't been found yet, but because that's how they are built. All this touches on themes that a lot of artists have been thinking about. Asparouhova's book, in fact, is published by a group of artists and thinkers called the Dark Forest Collective, named after writer Yancey Strickler's idea of the internet as a dark forest, a space that has become so contentious and commercial that the smart people retreat to more private digital spaces for authenticity and cachet. For me, Asparouhova's book helps focus in on the question of how difficult ideas and art that's not meant to go viral survive and find real fans now. Nadia, thank you for joining me to talk about this very interesting book.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get going, let's just define some terms. So maybe if we're going to talk about anti-mimetics or anti-memes, which is a word you use in the book, we need to just start with defining how we're talking about memes, because people think about cat memes and jokes. It's a broader sense that you mean memes or mimetic culture in this book, correct?
Yeah. So when I use the term meme, I'm drawing from Richard Dawkins' version of memes from his book, The Selfish Gene. And so he talks about memes as these self-replicating ideas that propagate in the way that genes do. And so, yes, that includes cat memes and stuff, but it also includes behavior like shaking hands or greeting people. I mean, it shows up in a lot of different smaller ways like that, as well as what he calls memeplexes, which are clusters of memes that form sort of like a bigger system. So if you think about religion or politics, they're all kind of made up of these smaller ideas that are all sort of self-replicating or propagating. So if memes are self-replicating ideas, an anti-meme is a self-censoring idea. So that means that it's something that's hard to remember or engage with, despite the fact that it is important and compelling to us in the moment. So if you think about something like taboos on a collective level or cognitive biases for us on an individual level, there are these truths. We can kind of look at them for a little bit, and then they kind of just seem to dissipate and fade away. And then I would say anti-mimetics would be the study of why do some of these ideas, despite being so compelling to us in the moment, struggle to propagate and spread through a network or a society? And what are the different cultural factors that cause that to happen?
Yeah, one of the things you say in the book is that what makes ideas anti-mimetic is how they propagate in semi-private settings. And that was one of the reasons why the book felt really relevant to me, because I feel like there's a lot of talk about the chat right now, you know,
Yes.
in a way that people used to talk about what they were seeing on social media, which people still do. But a lot of times, you know, both interpersonally with your friends or in big settings in the media, people are talking about the private chat, you know, private chats people are having as the place where the real action is, right?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think this is something that started happening really in the last 5-ish years. Group chats as a phenomenon for various reasons. We had this Web 2.0 era that's all the social platforms were initially invented, you know, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. And that was a period that made memes a thing, right? So like Dawkins wrote Selfish Gene in the 70s. The concept of a meme has been around in this modern sense for a really long time, but it was only in that era of the mid-2000s where suddenly this idea came to the forefront and social platforms really like amplified that for us. we're not in that anymore, right?
Yeah. You think that there's these kind of new anti-meme phenomenons have been brought to focus by the recent era. Before we get into the history, which I do want to get into, I just want to talk about the origin of the book or the origin of the idea. Was there an aha moment? Was there something you saw or read or detected that snapped the idea of an anti-meme or an anti-memeplex into focus for you?
Yes. So the term anti-meme, I wish came from me, but actually came from this fiction writing community online called the SCP Foundation. It's a wiki-style community where various users log these different imagined paranormal entities of many different kinds. And somewhere in the late 2000s, there was a user named Quantum who logged one of these paranormal entities that he called an anti-meme, where it's an entity that you can engage with in the moment, you can talk to it, you can remember all the details about it, and then you step away and then suddenly you can't seem to retain any information about having interacted with it. So super cool. And Quantum eventually built that out into a bigger idea and published this book called There Is No Anti-Memetics Division in 2021. And it's a horror sci-fi book about this idea of anti-memes as paranormal entities that are sort of stalking around in the universe. And I read this book. I was super fascinated by the idea. I just found it really, really compelling, something I'd never thought about really before. And I read it sort of in the context of having worked at Substack recently, where I joined pretty early on and had seen how this idea of newsletters was becoming a stand-in for people to sort of like escape the intensity of the highly public web. I had done that myself with my own newsletter. And, you see this shift happening from people saying, oh, aren't newsletters just sort of like marketing mailing lists to, oh, no, this is actually a place where I can have my own community and have it be a little bit more private, a little bit more separate from everything else. 2021 was also just sort of dark COVID days. We're kind of starting to see the edges of, how are people adapting to just like a very highly, intensely charged online public culture.
Like an all online culture in that case, like where everything had gone online.
Yeah, I think we were all sort of feeling it, that something was wrong or something was changing and shifting. But reading Quantum's book, There Is No Anti-Memetics Division, I think really just helped me imagine, I can see how this idea of anti-memes would apply to what is happening in the social web today. I wanted to write a nonfiction treatment of that basically and say, okay, what if we actually take these concepts a little bit more seriously? And if our writing is really wonderful in this way, that it can help us think about, how do these ideas apply to the real world? And that was the impetus for this book.
Actually, that book, There Is No Anti-Memetics Division, it began as this kind of Lovecraftian grassroots horror object online, sort of self-published. And I saw it's been picked up by Penguin Random House to be published later this year. So actually, you're right in this moment where this idea kind of appeared, crystallized in online spaces, and then is really going mainstream. There does seem to be something happening around this concept right now.
Definitely. Yeah, you can track almost the history of how anti-memes are coming into mainstream vernacular just by the success of the book, because Quantum started on a wiki community, Quantum self-published it, and then it just slowly gained so much popularity and traction in the last few years that then he got a deal with Penguin Random House to re-release the book, which is happening this fall. So it's kind of cool to see.
Yeah, it circulates in an anti-memetic way. And that's something I want to clarify for people. It's not just that ideas that don't spread, it's that they spread in a different way, or this kind of slower burn way, and how the book is kind of about how some of our most important ideas have to spread in that way. But before we go there, let's talk about the history, because we've talked around the recent past so far. One of the things you write in the book is we are living in late-stage mimetic society and early-stage anti-mimetic society. You write, if the mid-2000s were the point where memes took off, the late 2010s marked the point that anti-memes began to emerge as a counterforce to mimetic overload. So you already talked about the pandemic. Is there anything else that changed in how culture circulated in this period that changed or brought the anti-mimetic space into play?
It's funny. I think we often try to tell the story of the internet through changes in social attitudes or politics on sort of like this high level, but I think there's almost physics-based explanations for why some of these things happen, and I think that gets a little bit discussed less often. Yeah, like I said, mimetic and anti-mimetic behavior have been around forever, so you have plenty of simple behaviors that are mimetic. On the anti-meme side, you've had taboos whisper networks, secret societies for forever. This is not a new behavior, but there's something about when we give people these structures online to really amplify some of these phenomena, then different aspects of human behavior can sort of come out and take over. And so I think that's what happened with social platforms in the sort of 2000s and early 2010s, where people now just had a structure to really go hard on this certain kind of mimetic behavior. And by the late 2010s-ish, I don't know the exact date, but a lot of people have theories about when that date really was. But we hit this sort of like mimetic peak, right? Where everything was just too public. Ideas were escaping context too easily on these unfettered social platforms. And there was just a lot of heightened tensions online, right? Like this is sort of the height of the culture wars, which I think now we're sort of past that peak and can start to look at it and analyze it and talk about it in a different sort of way, which is partly why I wanted to write this book. But during that time, it just felt like, okay, it's really hard to say certain things online. You're afraid of the repercussions. You see the repercussions of saying the wrong thing that happened to other people. And it has this dampening or censoring effect. And anti-memes emerge as a reaction to that. So that's when you start seeing people burrowing into more private group chats or places where they can just talk to their friends or talk to people where they feel that they have a more trusted high context. You see newsletters starting to take off, private communities that are taking place on Slack or Discord. All these things started to coalesce right around the same time. And I think that was very directly a reaction to the mimetic overload. It's starting to become sort of like the new normal. We don't totally understand all the ways in which that's going to change how culture is circulated or distributed, but people are a lot more comfortable now just producing for smaller and more niche crowds. There's a feeling of like, I actually don't want my stuff to go viral. I don't want it to escape context, which is, I think, a fairly new behavior. It feels much more like still waters that are kind of running deep, where you can't always even see what are the coolest things that are happening at the surface, or you can't always see how things are spreading anymore. I've experienced this for sure with a lot of my writing, where things just kind of get passed around through back channels, and I don't even know how they're spreading or where they're going or how people are finding it anymore, versus the very direct, I'm going to post about this online and then I can literally track the interactions that people have with my tweets or something.
Right. Well, is it a new behavior? Because you talk about sacred knowledge in the book a little bit, about how like there has always been sacred knowledges that were considered to be so consequential that they had to spread slower, that there had to be sort of rituals of initiation and so on. It's very specific kind of spaces where people discovered certain kind of ideas, even certain kind of cultural experiences that are inexorably tied to how specific and special locations are. So is it a new thing, or is it just rediscovering an old thing after a period of forgetting because the internet made everything so public and people were still figuring out those rules?
I think it's more like the latter. I think the physics of these new sort of structures that we have online are more about amplifying or giving rise to behavior that we already engaged in, or that we already found ways to do it in different sorts of ways. But if we look at sort of like group chats, for example, like the idea of a multi-user text thread was only technologically enabled, I think, in like the mid-2010s. There wasn't a way to send a group text until the last, 10 years. People had these desires to, you want to find a semi-private space. You can't do everything totally publicly. And in the physical world, yeah, I can go into my house or I can have a quiet conversation on a side street. I'm not always broadcasting to everyone in the public square. Online, we just didn't even have a way to do that until fairly recently. And so now that we have the ability to do that stuff, you can start to see how it shapes our behaviors.
So there's been a lot of talk, and you address it in the book, a lot of chatter about how it's been a very bad time for culture. The new dark ages of creativity thesis. Lots of writing about how everything's the same, everything's recycled IP, everything is flattened out for the biggest, most popular audience. Is there anything about your analysis or your idea of anti-memes that helps reframe that conversation or render it a little more complex?
Yeah, I also have sort of a hot take on this that...
Oh, great.
But yes, I think the sort of dark ages of creativity kind of discourse that's happening right now, this is a symptom of us being in late-stage mimetic society where it feels like everything is designed to go viral, and so you get a lot of repetition, you get a lot of these warmed-over ideas because it feels like everyone around you is just catering to what works. I didn't want to write a pessimistic book about that. I think that's been written already and discussed already. I wanted to write a book about, okay, let's start by taking that as sort of like an accepted axiom that we're going to be building on top of, right? And so, okay, we're in this late stage of our society, but we're not going to be stuck in this pattern forever. Like, we're not going to be doomed to watching remakes of the same movies for the next 10, 20 years. Like, something is obviously going to change. And so what is actually new that is emerging from these ashes? I do think a lot of the norms have changed in the last 5 or 10 years. There are different ways of distributing your ideas online and consuming ideas that just didn't exist before. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. And I wanted to look at where is the opportunity here, right? So like, what are some fundamental principles that I think are really key to understanding anti-memes, anti-mimetics, and how they show up in the real world, in the same way that the idea of memes had been around for a while. And it was only when we saw them everywhere that we started to actually put a little bit more theory around it. And so I think we're in that same early stage society with anti-memes. And so if this is the new way of operating, I really want to encourage people to go do something with that knowledge and feel empowered by that. If you don't like the reality that you're living in right now, then we have a lot of power to figure out how to make that look different for yourself and for other people. So I see it less as like a dark age. I think it's more a transitional one. I think I also questioned the thesis itself a little bit as well.
Yeah.
My more like hot take, but I suspect that we are maybe also just glutted with the privilege of having too much access at this point to a lot of really good creative work. It feels like we just get to eat pastries every day and we're going, oh my God, like more pastries again. I don't want this. And whereas 10 years ago, we'd be thrilled to have even one of these things. And, I think there's way more noise today, but objectively, there's also just way more good stuff out there to consume. I think expectations have gone way up on taste in terms of what do we wear? How do our houses look? Like how do we look? I had a friend, Eugene Way, who wrote this piece called Status as a Service a few years back. He was talking about how expectations have changed so much on Twitter, where it used to be that you could just tweet about what you're eating for breakfast. And now he likened it more to, instead of playing for a small stage, you're like Beyonce at Coachella. And I think about that a lot. I don't even know whether has overall quality gone down, or is it just, yes, a lot of other noise, but there's actually like so much good stuff around us that we're not even appreciating anymore.
Yeah, well, I question the thesis too. I mean, not because there's not a lot of bad stuff, although I think you're right that there's also probably more good stuff than ever before. There's just more stuff. I mean, people were consuming more images, more stuff than ever before. Just look at the statistics. But I also just am kind of like, at what time in history has the good art of its age been the stuff that was the most popular in that time? I mean, any basic study of art history is like, yeah, a lot of stuff, probably half or more that we remember as a really significant stuff from any particular time period was running against the grain of what was popular. And actually, that's kind of what makes it, in retrospect, so significant, because it has a little bit of tension and struggle that we can connect with. And that's kind of what you're getting at in terms of defining anti-mimetic spaces, that when people talk about the new dark ages of creativity, that might just be like, there's an incredibly efficient system to deliver popular stuff to you now. And we haven't quite worked out the systems by which we find the countercultural stuff, or the relay between counterculture, the stuff that makes us feel situated, makes us feel we have something special, and then connecting with other people. The internet, because it's placeless and stuff, is scrambled a lot of that.
That's a great framing. I definitely resonate with that.
Essentially, one way to look at your book is intervention into this conversation about virality and viral media and viralness. And one of the impressive parts of it, I think, is that you take that metaphor and, to my mind, you say, do we really use that metaphor to its fullest extent? I mean, I guess you're drawing on other thinkers' ideas here, but one of the things you talk about is that when we talk about viral media, we usually are just talking about contagiousness, how spreadable an idea is. And then there are all these other ideas that you could take from virality. You can talk about the immunity of a community or the symptomatic period of a community in terms of ideas as well as viruses. And that once you look at those, that gives you a different way to think about what it means to go viral or for ideas to spread like viruses. That's maybe a little abstract still. Can you maybe flesh out some of those ideas? Because I thought it was really important in terms of the significance of anti-memes as intervening into this conversation about viral media.
The Web 2.0 era gifted us with this phrase of going viral. And even until now, that's kind of the only term that we have to describe whether an idea is interesting or has found purchase among a certain set of readers or consumers or whatever. I just find it really limiting, especially in this era where you can kind of look around and say, a lot of people don't want their ideas to spread too much, but they want it to spread somewhat, right? And this idea of going viral, it's too binary. It doesn't really give us that level of nuance that we need. And so I return the term going viral, obviously refers to viruses and contagiousness. And so I go back to epidemiology and say, okay, let's go borrow a few more terms from the idea of like how viruses spread, just so we have a more nuanced way of talking about ideas today. So one of the things I talk about is transmission rate. So that's the probability that someone who has been infected by an idea is actually going to go on and spread it or evangelize it to their connections, right? So just because someone has been infected by an idea doesn't mean that they're actually going to share it with anyone else. And so you can see how that would work in sort of an anti-mimetic context where an idea is compelling, but we're not talking about it in a public way. I also talk about this idea of immunity. So you can imagine two people are presented with the same idea, and one person totally falls in love with it, becomes really enamored with it. For someone else, it just kind of like bounces off of them, and they're kind of like, it's not really for me, right? So the point being there that not all, I say sort of like nodes in a network, people are nodes, but not all the nodes in a network will have the same likelihood of being infected just because they're both exposed to an idea. Then there's this idea of symptomatic period. How long does someone actively express an idea that they're infatuated with? And I think this is a really important distinction between memes and anti-memes, because memes, they spread really, really fast, but they kind of just like pass right through us, right? So you think about sharing a link or a tweet with a friend or something, and you kind of like forget that you did that. Sometimes they'll respond or you're like, oh yeah, I forgot that I sent you this link, right? So they kind of just pass right through us. I keep thinking about norovirus because everyone had norovirus over the winter and it was terrible. And and it's like the worst thing if you've had it because you feel really, really sick for a day or two, just, you feel like absolute hell. And then suddenly you're just like better and you kind of move on, right? But it can really rip through a household if someone gets it. Whereas like anti-memes have these longer symptomatic periods, right? So they stick with us for longer. It feels more like a parasite or something. Sorry, these are kind of gross metaphors, but yeah, an anti-meme is something where it's like, it can live dormant in your body for a really long time. You might not even know that you have this parasite living in your body. It might be subtly shaping your behavior or your health because you're not even aware that it's there. So again, I think there's this idea that's just because someone is infected with any, it does not mean that they're always expressing it. It can stick with them for a lot longer or shorter periods of time.
It's not a term you use in the book, but I really think about these ideas of subculture or counterculture in reading it, about how there are certain kinds of cultures that are defined by the fact that they put you in conflict with the dominant culture. And that a lot of the conversation about artistic style assumes that the goal of it is to be consumable. Like you're stylizing something to make it spread faster. Whereas another role for style is to make something feel really specific and that it needs to be decoded in a certain kind of way. And so I like this idea that there are cultural things that they're weirder, so they spread slower, but it's more consequential to assimilate them and harder to pass on because it involves a kind of a private language. You talk about the value of an esoteric style for certain thinkers in your book. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I talk about this idea of Straussian writing.
From the philosopher Leo Strauss, yeah.
Yes, you're writing in a way that it might seem sort of unremarkable to the general public. There's this one way that it has a very obvious public meaning, but then there's this hidden, deeper meaning for a certain audience that might understand certain subtleties, maybe certain language that you're using, certain terms, things like that. So it's a way of being able to write about controversial or difficult topics in public, but trusting that the message is only going to reach certain people that are meant to understand it. And it doesn't always have to be this nefarious or subversive thing, but it's just sort of, if you're in maybe a more hostile environment, or you just want to be more targeted about what you're saying, it's kind of a nice way to double write at the same time. I love that you're drawing this connection to style. It makes me think about fashion style as well, where there's like this sort of Scandi, minimalist fashion style where on the surface, you're kind of dressing in ostensibly a white t-shirt and jeans or something. And it doesn't look that interesting to someone who is not really looking for it. But it really appeals to someone who goes, oh, I recognize that totem bag or shoes from the row or something. And you know that you're not dressing to be super flashy to everyone, but you're wearing certain brands, you're curating your clothes in a certain kind of way, that it's this if you know kind of style, right?
If you know, yeah.
It just gives you this more fine-grained control over who an idea or a message will reach. This is kind of the fun part of style more generally, right? Is you can present things in different ways to convey a different vibe depending on how you feel or what you're trying to say. So I think that's a really useful metaphor.
I love that you mentioned the fashion example just because it makes me think of something I wanted to ask you, which is one of the questions I had coming out of the book was like, have we ever really lived in a fully mimetic society? Because I was just thinking about how important the word community is. You know, it's just a buzzword in a lot of tech and fashion circles, or the idea of the cult brand, that it just seems for as long as things have been viral, there's also been this hunger to kind of like prove, to advertise that something is exclusive as well. It's almost like the value of going behind the VIP rope obviously goes up the more popular something is. So these things are really closely linked. Not that the idea of exclusivity went away, but it just became a very highly marketable and public and visible phenomenon.
Yeah. And I talk about this in the book as sort of this metaphor of these two cities that have just been living on top of each other the whole time. And we've kind of only really noticed the mimetic one for a while. And I especially think in the context of constructing an online world or a parallel sort of online reality for ourselves, like the internet is still so young. And maybe we started out by noticing this mimetic city, but we've failed to notice that all these sort of dynamics have been around forever. And it was inevitable that they would eventually get, layered on top of that mimetic version of the online city. And in a lot of ways, I think none of this stuff is new. We're just starting to see how it plays out in really different contexts.
One of the reasons I want to talk to you is because the book talks about the value of having the right, what you call anti-mimetic environment for a creative person, both for success, practically, to find an audience, and for fulfillment creatively, to find your personal voice. So maybe for our audience, just talk a little bit about that. What's the value of an anti-mimetic environment for artists?
I really struggled with this on a personal level, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it while researching and writing my first book, Working in Public, which was about the lives of open source software developers and these challenges that they face writing and managing public code that we all rely on. At the time, I was not aware of the concept of anti-mimetics, but I had heard so many stories in interviewing these developers about they're really struggling to produce creative work code in this context when they just constantly have an angry or otherwise demanding mob that is leaping down their throats and facing that harsh reality and drawing the parallels between what open source developers are facing and other types of online creators. I felt that on a personal level. It's not like I have some, mega audience or anything, but as your audience starts to grow, you start to feel this pull of social pressure. There's a negative and a positive version of this kind of mimetic pressure that any sort of creator faces. And so the negative version of it is maybe the more obvious one that people talk about more, where random people on the internet or your fans or whomever can be really harsh or critical. You can get negative comments sometimes. It's kind of a trope now, but...
Yeah, visibility has its price, yeah.
Yeah. You can get like 100 amazing comments and then you get one bad one and you're just like, ugh, that kind of hurt, So that's a negative version of it. But then there's a positive version of it as well. And I think sometimes people are embarrassed to talk about this, so they don't. But the positive version is that people love your work so much that they just want more and more of that exact same thing, right? And so you start getting pigeonholed as you're the person who did this thing. And if you have like one really big success, then people just are constantly referring to that one thing. And musicians, sometimes they're just like, I want to play my new stuff. And it's really hard to break out of that. And I think that is also a version of mimetic pressure where your most popular idea is spreading around everywhere. And it can be hard to find an appreciative environment, even among your fans, trying to do something a little different or work on a different topic. And so I think it's really important for artists to have these semi-private spaces where they can workshop their ideas among trusted peers or people who will appreciate that kind of nuance when they're trying something new. But I think also these semi-private spaces are not just incubators for new ideas, but they're kind of becoming this terminal point in themselves. Maybe I'm just going to produce stuff for this smaller niche audience, and that's okay. I think the flip side of that being that it's also good to push yourself into new spaces so you don't just end up in an echo chamber. So
perhaps that's the real new thing, is this idea that not just being in private communities, but maybe stepping away from the public one and really focusing on the anti-mimetic space, the more private, denser communication environment.
I definitely see it among a lot of my peers or people that are working on creative stuff. I mean, even publishing this book was sort of a decision to say, we're going to publish it through a label that's curated an audience that we already know cares a lot about these kinds of ideas. So I published it with Dark Forest Collective, which is an independent label that had already published a piece about how the social web was changing in these sorts of ways. And that just felt like the right place to do it in, because it felt like I would be talking to people that would sort of like understand it. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely something to that of, it doesn't feel like you're playing for a small time audience all the time anymore, right? Sometimes it just feels like this is the right audience. It can feel so much more fulfilling to get great feedback from 100 people who are deeply engaged with your work versus a million people who are kind of just transactionally just giving these drive-by comments. I think that was the lesson of why Substack took off too, of just, newsletters are a way to curate that. And I think like anyone who's found some success or resonated with an audience before, after a while, the sort of generic drive-by comments, it starts to get old. It doesn't always feel so great anymore. Just kind of get more people saying, awesome, great. And so you start to crave something a little bit deeper. You crave a little bit more intentional interaction.
That definitely resonated with me in your book. And just practically, when I've taught, I've always told students in terms of practical career advice, the best piece is don't immediately look to the biggest level of success. That audience, the first step is always find your people. Find a small group of people to work with on creative projects who can kind of nourish you, who you can rise with together, find your space. And then I'm terrible at social media. I've always found it really fatiguing and performative. On one level, though, your book kind of disabused me of the idea. I like the idea of dropping out and that there's this new creative world forming in the shadows where people focus on substantial connections and weirder stuff. But since we're talking about anti-mimetic spaces, and I do romanticize these spaces, I think there's something like recreating in the online space the sort of indie vibe or the creative vitality of a small scene. I think that's very cool, really worth emphasizing, both for creativity and for ideas. You also do say, just to end on a cautionary note, that there's a dark side to anti-mimetic spaces too, or there can be. So what should people be concerned about or watch out for?
Yeah, I really didn't want to write a book about how the overly simplistic version would be, we had these super public spaces, everyone retreated, now we have private spaces, and now we're happy. Like, I don't actually think that's the story. I think there is this hidden dark side to anti-mimetic spaces that I do want to caution against. I think the initial reaction against the mimetic overload was people retreating to these spaces because they wanted somewhere to be themselves. They felt that it was more private, more authentic, and they thought that it felt more safe. But the flip side is that being in these small confined spaces can also breed insularity, this sort of gate-kept community. And so I use the example of, or metaphor of Charles Darwin and speciation. And the reason why the Galapagos Islands breed so much biodiversity is because it's an archipelago. So you have lots of little islands that are separated from each other, and different species can mutate and become totally crazy different things much more quickly in these smaller isolated environments. And so if you think about group chats as a sort of archipelago, it's the same sort of thing where ideas can mutate and get really strange, not always in good ways, when you're sort of trapped in these smaller spaces.
Hothouse, yeah.
So I use the analogy of COVID pods. And I'm sure everyone had some version of this experience through the pandemic where you say, okay, I'm just going to hang out with my 10 good friends and we're going to be safe from COVID because it's just the 10 of us and none of us have COVID, so we're good. And then, you quickly learn that life is not quite that simple, right? It's much harder to truly live in that isolated environment because someone is always going to the grocery store or secretly hang out with some other friends or something. And if someone brings a contagion back into that small pod, now you've just created this small sort of super spreader. There's still a main feed out there. There's still some version of online public discourse, right? It's not that group chats replaced social feeds. They're still heavily influenced by what is going on in quote unquote out there on the online world. And so you have people in these group chats that are bringing in ideas from the outside world and bringing them into a small, confined, high-trust space where ideas can transmit and spread through each other very quickly. And that's where ideas can start to mutate. That's sort of one of my concerns about it. And I'd say the other is just, it's great that we have these private spaces where people feel like they can be themselves, but I think we still also need to keep information flowing back into public spaces. The worst version of this is you end up with these elite gated communities where the best, most thoughtful, most interesting people are just keeping their thoughts to themselves. And I definitely feel this struggle where I don't really enjoy being on super public social media. And it's really nice to just hang out with other people who think like me, and I can share my thoughts in these more raw and unfiltered formats. Venkatesh Rao, who is a writer that I talk about and cite in the book, he had initially come up with this term cozy web to describe this version of the web where everyone's kind of hunkered down in their own little spaces. And he kind of hates the term now. And he's talked about this in the past as Walden ponding, where the behavior that he calls is where it's, you're just sort of like isolated and you're saying, well, I'm better than everyone else because I'm over here being quiet and in my high quality discourse and whatever. But maybe a little old school for me to say, but I want to encourage civic participation. I think we are all kind of part of the problem. And if the outside environment is so hostile that we're all hiding behind these gated communities, then the commons kind of burns, right? So you have to think about, how do you force yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, to get back out there and share ideas back into the public square?
Well, it's a very complex conversation. We could go on talking about different nuances of it for a long time, but I want to let people discover the book and discover your writing in whatever space they feel comfortable with. The book is called Anti-Mimetics. It's published by Meta Label and the Dark Forest Collective. I encourage everybody to check it out. Nadia, thanks so much for coming on That Angle, talking with me about all this very interesting theory.
Thanks. It's great to chat.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review our show. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.